Welcome to this webinar about how you create a value-generating service catalog to continuously cater for your Microsoft Dynamics application. You should find this webinar interesting if you're creating, managing, or evaluating an existing AMS organization. We will cover topics like how you design your service catalog, so what considerations you need to make, but also how you actually define a service. And I'll end up the webinar by introducing you to some of the thoughts we have done in Alpha People about how we have built our catalog. The webinar is part of a series of webinars that we have done on our application maintenance services. So if you find this one interesting, feel free to browse our website to find the other ones as well. My name is Carsten Krag, and I'm responsible for our application management services here in Alpha People across Europe. I have a technical background, but I spent the last decade or so creating AMS organizations for various companies and hereby Alpha People. But before we actually talk about how you build your service catalog, let's just take a step back and figure out why do we believe that application management is so important. Well, if we look at Microsoft Dynamics, it's basically a business application built on two pillars, business and IT. These are two pillars that haven't been more dynamic than right now. Companies change all the time. Organizations change all the time. Companies are acquiring companies. You are changing your processes, you are adding new products, you're adding new markets, you are looking into new domains. So companies change. So does IT in a more rapid state than we have ever seen before. And in Microsoft Dynamics, you are being pushed new features all the time. In Microsoft Azure, you are having multiple new ways of connecting your applications every day. So why would you have a static interface between those two? It doesn't really work. We need to move away from the era where we spend 80% of our budget building an application and only 20% trying to maintain it for the next 5 years. We need to move into an era where we spend less on the initial implementation and more on the continuous enhancements and alignment to the new features of both the business and the IT. So if we need to get to that new era, we also need to rethink how we think about application management services. It needs to be not as much as a cost driver, something we need to do at the lowest cost possible, but actually seeing it as a value generator. This is actually where we generate the value that connects the newest technology to our new business processes. But let's look at the service catalog. There are multiple ways you can do this. If you go by ITIL standard, there is a life cycle that they have here called strategy, design, transition, and operation. If you're more traditional kind, in terms and comes from the implementation world, project implementation world, you're more used to the terms analysis, design, implementation, and support. Regardless, it's pretty much the same. But if you look at application management services, those are traditionally focused around the last phase, so the operations phase or support phase. If we need to move into this new era, we need to consider that application management services needs to cover the entire life cycle. So from strategy to operation or from analysis to support. We also need to consider that we actually need to have both proactive and reactive services. So if we look at how most companies and also support providers are focused today, it is on reactive services within the operations or support phase. But try and consider in each phase, could we do proactive measures and what kind of reactive measures should we actually have? When you have sort of consolidated what you need to do, what services you want to have, incident management, problem management are typical scenarios of the last one, but it could also be roadmap planning. It could be monitoring. There are so many services you can add, end-user training, right? So there are so many services you can add to this. So when you sort of brainstorm the whole catalog, you need to sit down and define them in more detail. So how should you do that? I have based my last couple of AMS organizations on the same way of defining a service. So if we have the service in the middle, we should define roles and responsibilities. So who should do what? We should define if there is any documentation artifacts coming out of it. Are there any meetings that we need to have with some stakeholders? The internal process of how do we transform an input to an output in this specific service? How do we govern the service? And can we do some continuous service improvement to it? And then, are there any tools we need in order for this service to drive or to improve the service? Remember that when defining a service, that is actually your golden opportunity to introduce some operational excellence. This is actually where you can take a lot of experiences and best practices and build it into your service. And remember again that the more specific you design the service, the more repetitive the execution of the service will be, the more quality and productivity you will gain. But let's look at all these parameters individually. If we take the first one, roles and responsibilities, let's put some ground rules first. A role is carried out by one person, so a role cannot be shared between persons. A person can have multiple roles, right? And many people can have the same role. Okay, so those are the ground rules. So how do you actually put the scope of a role? Well, you have, to come with examples, you can have a service delivery manager, a functional lead, a technical lead, a deployment manager, a release manager. So you have some functional encapsulation of that. You can also have management roles, business roles, end user roles, or external stakeholders. It's really important that you define your external stakeholders as well. And when I say external, it doesn't mean to be external in terms of externals to the company you're working, but it can be externals compared to your AMS setup. So it could be if there is another AMS organization in your own company that has a different application, they are externals to you because you might have an interface to them. Then what is a role? A role is a definition of responsibilities. But you should take it a step further. Say, okay, so how are those responsibilities materialized into tasks? All right, so we have a role, has responsibilities. Responsibilities are held up by tasks. But how are those tasks performed? That's where you either define when they are initiated. Is it by schedule? Is it by event? In that case, you are coming down to a degree of a description of a role, which makes it very easy for someone to read and execute. So try to get those 3 levels in there. Moving on to the next one, documentation artifacts. Pretty easy, right? We will have, during the course of maintaining an application, we have a set of documentation that we need to take care of. It can be system documentation, it can be technical documentation, it can be service reports, it can be pretty much anything which is a written material that we need to maintain, create, maintain, distribute. So when having identified those, well, we should create templates for them. We should be very specific about who is the author of them, when are they created, updated, maintained, distributed, and who are the recipients of this. Because when you have sort of detailed that, your documentation artifacts are much more to the point. I've seen many examples when we have taken over AMS services from competitors or from internals. We see loads of documentation artifacts where we don't really see the value of them. But I promise you that if you do this structure, you will see actually value-generated documentation artifacts. Meetings. So we just identified a lot of roles: external stakeholders, business roles, internal roles, technical roles. But if we look at the entire spectrum or life cycle, these roles should meet in regular intervals to discuss various things. So we need to put that into a schedule. So some meetings are either scheduled in a cyclic manner, every month, every week, every day, every quarter. But it can also be that they are scheduled by event, like a major incident management meeting is perhaps called upon when we receive a major incident. But the major part here is that all the different meetings across all our services should be defined about when are they scheduled, by event, by schedule, their duration, their location, is it online, is it physical, an agenda point, who should participate, And should they prepare something before they participate, or should they have a task after they have participated? When you do this, you get a meeting framework of a list of many meetings that you need to have. But I guarantee you that if you execute this, you will have perhaps more meetings, but they will be much more efficient and short. So you perhaps have a whole lot of 15-minute meetings, but that also means that you are moving along all the time. You don't need to wait until something has happened before you talk to someone. Next point is processes. Processes. So this is where you connect your roles, your meetings, your documentation. You identify what is the input of the process, what is the output of the process, and then you use what is then created in between. So remember that detailing the process is an act of balance. If you do too much detail, it might be a hindrance towards your productivity. If you're becoming too less descriptive in your description, it might be too loose and you might not get the same output every time. So it is an act of balance on how detailed you want your process descriptions to be. An important part when we describe something as a process, there is something that I call the power of acceptance. So when do we not follow the process becomes very evident. And that can be a major tool in actually managing it. Because if you have designed a process saying this is what we should do in 80% of the time, 90% of the time, then perhaps assign someone to have the authority to say, but in this special case, we'll do something different. But then it's obvious to everybody that we are not following our processes. And be sure to hand that authority to one role or at least a specific person to make that decision on when not to follow the process. But you should always consider that you cannot predict everything. So have the back door to saying this guy has the opportunity to make the decision that we are not following, in this specific case, we're not following our processes. Governance. When you consider your governance model, try really to consider what is the purpose of this governance. Because the governance for the sake of governance is not really value adding anything. So try to consider, why are you considering this kind of governance? Is it to control something? Is it to review something? Is it to ensure something? Or is it to measure something in order to compare it later to something else? You should also consider the schedule of it. So when do we do these things? Is it by day, by week, by month, by quarter? What is it? Do you need a report? Do you need a number? So how do you materialize that governance into something that can be read? And what do you do about that information later? Because if you're not really doing anything but just generating a lot of data and a lot of governance reporting, but not really acting on it, it's not really adding value either. So try and think about governance by the whole cycle, about why we're doing it, how we implement it directly, and how we act on it. Continuous service improvement. One area that could benefit largely from having a good structured governance model is the continual service improvement. So this is where you actually use all the data, the metrics, the governance structure you created to figure out where you can improve. I feel this is a really vital part of defining your service, because if you cannot improve your service, aligning it all the time, it will decrease in value day by day. So try to create a structure around your continuous service improvement so you have constantly new targets to achieve, constantly finding stuff that you could do better and trying to implement them. And just consider that now we have done all this job, defining all the processes, the roles, the key deliverables. Actually making an adjustment for the better is easier because you have all the documentation ready, you have all the templates, you have all the process descriptions. So it's just about figuring out, connecting the dots a little bit different and rolling it out. Because it's very easy for the people executing all these services to see, okay, now I don't need to address that in that manner, I need to do this instead. So we do this. And then the next governance report coming, we can actually measure whether that had a positive effect or not. The last thing I'm going to address today about how we define our services are tools. I'm not going to talk much about it because it really depends on what the service is actually about, which tools cater to it the best. But I'm going to leave you with one thing to consider. When we have defined our services in the detail level that we have using this framework, they are bound to be executed with more and more repetition. That also means that there are a business case to be made on automation. It might not be in the beginning. It might not be until after at least a couple of continuous service improvement cycles that you're actually seeing now we have reached a steady state of our service that we can actually automate or at least semi-automate part of the processes. So there is a lot of business potential and a lot of cost saving by having automation. And there is actually a lot of stuff in the AMS space that can be automated. So definitely something to consider. So to sum up, you should build a service catalog based on the entire life cycle and not only on the operational and support part. You should consider both proactive and reactive services. You should define your services by using roles, meeting, documentation, and processes. You should try and detach the meetings and the docs from the specific services to be shared among several services and in that way achieve a bigger efficiency. Then you should define a governance structure and a governance program to enable a tangible continuous service improvement that is something that really can be executed. And remember, it's all a balance. If you define these things too much, you will be obstructing your productivity. If you define them too less, you will most likely not achieve the repetitive part, enabling automation, continuous service improvement. Before we conclude this webinar, I promised you that I would shed a little light on how we have worked with our service catalog here in Alpha People. So currently, Alpha People AMS is a tailored service towards Microsoft Dynamics. It consists of 20 services, both reactive and proactive. And we have a continuous service improvement cycle, which is quarterly, meaning that every quarter we gather all our intelligence, figure out where are we overperforming, where are we underperforming. We are measuring our metrics across our customers to figure out whether an overperformance or an underperformance is on a specific customer or something we can see as a tendency. And by there, we are continuously improving our services. We are at a point now where we're not only using our benchmarks to share across our customers, but actually also engaging third-party advisors that are using those in comparing the total market in the industry. Another point I want to make is that when you address, and that has been specifically good for Alpha People, when you start to address processes in this kind of detail level, you figure out stuff where you do not want to follow standard. Stuff where you want to do things different than your competitors. I'll address some of them, or at least give you two examples. The first one is our incident management process. Normally when you call a support, you will talk to a first level first, knows very little. You may be delegated or sent on to level 2 that knows a little bit more, and you explain your whole situation again, and he cannot solve it, and you'll be sent to a third person, and maybe he can solve it. We have decided to reverse that. So you're speaking to the most knowledgeable person first, and if he sees that this is something someone else can handle, you're being redirected to that person. So in this case, we are adding value from the very first contact we have with our end users. Another lesson we learned by working on these continuous service improvements was that our major incident process needed to be completely different. When one of our customers have a major incident, it's a huge business impact. So we need to be able to solve the issue fast. And most of our customers like to add the phrase, regardless of the cost, because we need to solve it. The server has broken down, every salesman, if it's CRM, every salesman around the globe is at a stop. We need to solve it. So we changed our processes for our major incident management to something completely different. We call it Qualify Out. It means that all our stakeholders are immediately pinged and all joining a mutual call, and then you qualify out. So the infrastructure guy, the application guy, the technical guy, the adjacent stakeholders for the adjacent systems, everybody is calling in. Everybody is hands on deck from the first minute, and then they qualify out. Say, it's not here, it's not here, it's not here, it's not here. When we reversed that process to fit that, we saw that our major incident management become much better and much more efficient. So again, I urge you to define your catalog, but perhaps the most important part here is actually the continuous service improvement. To be able to continuously measure how you're doing and then do it better the next time. And that concludes the webinar on Service Catalog. If you found it interesting and want to read more, there is plenty more material of the same kind on our website. My name is Carsten Krag, and thank you for listening.